Okay. All right, I think we can start. As you can see, this is the panel that's going to be talking about promising new targets for neurology and psychiatry drugs. If you're not interested in these topics, you have boarded the wrong plane. But my name is Domingos Silva. I'm a patent attorney and vice co-chair of the IP group at Saul Ewing, which is a full practice law firm. We are very glad to have worked with Yale for many, many years as in decades at this point. And I've had the pleasure of protecting the technology that came out of Yale labs, including of Dr. Krystal here. So today we're going to be talking about drugs that are used to treat neurological and psychiatric conditions. That's a very interesting topic because, as you know, only recently there have been use for interventions in these diseases from a therapeutic standpoint. Needless to say, for many years in the past, patients who suffer from deep psychological problems had basically no alternatives, right? People were put away in a house somewhere and there was no effort to treat them except for sedating them heavily. And now we have therapeutic interventions that give people the opportunity to be a part of society as they should be. Together, we put together this panel that brings people who do research and development of drugs in these two areas. So I'm going to start this panel by basically asking everybody on our panel to talk about who they are and their involvement in these fields. Maybe we can start, Professor Krystal.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is John Krystal. I'm the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Yale and a co-founder of Freedom Biosciences. This is really an extraordinary moment in the history of psychiatry over the span of my career, which goes back a few years. I joined the Yale faculty in '88, and you know, there was a first generation of psychiatric drug discovery in the late 1950s, where we saw the tricyclic antidepressants, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the antipsychotic medications, lithium, all emerge. And mechanistically novel treatments in psychiatry did not appreciably advance from that early phase of discovery all the way to about 2019 with the FDA approval of esketamine and brexanolone. But the new treatments are so extremely important and have generated so much excitement and investment in psychiatric drug development that the trend of pharmaceutical industry moving away from psychiatry, hopefully we're starting to see that reverse, and particularly with the development of a number of impactful smaller companies. But just to give you an idea of how critically important this revolution is, that we have high rates of non-response to the currently available treatments for depression, say. And these new treatments like ketamine, esketamine, potentially the psychedelics and MDMA, produce rapid response in patient populations that have not previously responded to available treatments, transforming their lives, reducing the burden of mental illness, and alleviating distress. So this is exciting. We've seen these new medications emerge as a first generation of novel and transformative treatments, and we're at the cusp of a next generation of innovative therapeutics in this space. Non-dopamine D2 receptor blocking antipsychotics, potentially non-hallucinogenic psychedelic medications, improvements in the efficacy and tolerability of rapid-acting antidepressants like ketamine. And those drugs will continue this momentum of improvement. So probably overdone my time already, but it's, you know, others will speak to other challenges and opportunities, but overall, I think this is an extraordinary moment and a unique one in my career. So I'll stop there.
Great. I'm Allyson Rinderle. I'm a managing director at Bain Cap Life Sciences. So thank you all for coming today. Maybe just briefly on our fund. So we're a life sciences dedicated fund. We're investing out of our third fund. It's $1.9 billion. We typically write checks ranging from 50 to 150 million, largely in clinical stage biopharma companies and other life sciences companies, including medtech, tools, diagnostics, and pharma services. In terms of our interest in neuro, it's a space that we think there's a tremendous unmet need and opportunity. We've made a number of investments to date and continue to look at this space. So Cerevel is one that we actually created with Pfizer in 2018 and still active investors in, as well as a number of other ones. We both look at opportunities in terms of opportunistic things as well as proactive thematic work. And neuro is one of these thematic areas that we spend time. And so we're looking at neurodegeneration, neuropsych, we're looking at neuromuscular, epilepsy, so a lot of different areas, and look forward to the conversation today.
Okay. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vlad Coric. I'm the CEO of Biohaven. You're probably wondering, how did a brain-based focused company end up in New Haven, Connecticut? And to understand that, I think you have to understand where the passion came from for me in neuroscience, and it's no accident it's in New Haven, given John's department and others that have been at the forefront of brain research. So my parents worked on the grounds of a psychiatric hospital here in Connecticut, and I grew up there. So I interacted with people with severe mental illness from a very young age, and it was a unique experience, to say the least. But at that early age, it hit me that these were medical disorders no different than diabetes and heart disease, but there was a stigma around them. And so I really became interested in how do you understand the biologic underpinnings of neuropsychiatric disorders. And that led me to a residency at Yale in John's department, where he was a great mentor to me. So thank you, John. And many of our ideas, occurred on that neuroscience ward where we both worked. But something struck me many years into the research, in that universities are really good at uncovering truths and scientific mechanisms, but not as good at bringing something to market. They don't take those truths to market, right? And so it hit me, you had to learn about the business world. You had to learn how do you translate that science and that mechanism of action to patients to make a difference. Because over my whole career, I saw not much actually change in the clinical care in neurology and psychiatry. Thankfully, that's changed, right? As John was saying, in the recent years, thanks to decades of academic work that was quite robust and newer technologies, we finally are at the place where our field is changing, right? And there's a lot of examples of new cutting-edge technology and new therapeutics that we wouldn't even imagined those mechanisms would have worked in neurology and psychiatry. So I think we're at one of the most exciting times in brain disorder research. And it's ironic that about 8 to 10 years ago, most of large pharma left neuroscience research. They said it was too risky and it wasn't mature enough. That created a great business opportunity, and that was the genesis for me of Biohaven, and again, why we're here in New Haven. So huge opportunity with the worst disorders facing society, opportunity to start a company to focus on that when everyone else is running away from it, and we and others are advancing really novel therapies. So both from a personal perspective of science, but also a business perspective, it's a great time to be in the field of brain research, and I hope Big Pharma doesn't get completely back in soon.
Wow, it's a little bit hard to follow this this panel. So my name is Tanya Fischer. I also work at Biohaven. Vlad's my boss. And for me, neuroscience is really tough, but very rewarding. How I got into neuroscience research is that I have an MD PhD, and when I was doing my PhD, I was trying to figure out, where do I go? I was an analytical chemist in my undergrad, and when I was learning about everything, I said, the brain, very complex. We know a lot of strides have been made in it, but there's still much more to be done. And for me, that is so very exciting. And as a neurologist, I went in my residency to being able to diagnose patients and have some treatments, to being here today where we have a lot of treatments. My excitement in clinical, in the pharma world is I really enjoy precision-based therapy. I really like being able to marry genetics with what we know in neuroscience. And also what I find to be very exciting is technology and how we can find things in the neurology and psychiatric space where we can better understand and better quantify changes that can hopefully bring forward new medicines to patients in desperate need. And so I think I agree with everybody here on the panel that this is a very, very exciting time in neuroscience because so much is before us. We have very interesting genetics, we have very interesting AI, we have very interesting digital technology, and it allows us to learn from one another and to be able to move things forward faster for patients.
Hi, I'm Steve Knight, and I actually don't know why I'm on this panel. The only thing I could figure out, Vlad, is that I think, as I've told you many times, we very foolishly said no to you twice. So yeah, and that was a big, big mistake. So I run a firm called F Prime, which is a venture capital firm where the majority of the funding is in the life sciences. We're early stage investors. There's a little over $4.5 billion under management, and we invest across all areas, some in neuroscience, in psych and neurodegenerative disease. Although I was originally trained as an MD, and physicians around the world patients around the world are rejoicing that I'm not treating anybody anymore. One of the things that struck me when I was in medical school, thinking that I was going to go into neurology, thinking in general 35 years ago, how little we did for patients in general. And for me, oncology was the area that struck me because it was an area where there's quite obvious, obvious and graphic suffering. And in those days, there wasn't a lot you did for many, many, many oncology patients. The one thing that did happen over my career is that has changed, and that's changed in genetic diseases as well, where I would argue for the first time in human history, because of attention to kind of genetic causes and understanding pathways in a deep level, we're able to cure a limited number of diseases. My hope is that in psychiatry and in neurodegenerative diseases, we'll move from a time in which we're descriptive and treating symptoms into truly treating diseases. And I think that is one of the reasons why we remain very interested in this area. There's a couple of companies that we've started in the area. One of them is a company called Denali, which was going after neurodegenerative disease. The idea was as simple as this is where oncology was 15 years ago. And we got to get to the root causes, find the patients, understand the pathways, and then try to treat the failures in the pathways. There's a couple other companies that we've recently invested in the psych area. Nomura, John, and you're kindly on the scientific advisory board there, and then another company called Rugen. So I'm very hopeful, but always terrified because it's a hard area.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellie McGuire. I'm a partner at Polaris Partners. I'll tell you a little bit about Polaris. So we're a 25-year-old healthcare-focused venture capital firm. And our investments really span across healthcare. So we do quite a bit in biotech, primarily therapeutic platforms, and then we also invest in healthcare IT and healthcare services companies. Within the biotech investments and therapeutics, we really span indications and modalities. And so within that, CNS is a really important area for us, and one in which I think we've done increasing investments in, probably starting about 10 years ago. And so our investments in the space right now are in neurodegeneration and genetic neurological diseases, as well as psych. And for me individually, I'm particularly involved with a company called Muna Therapeutics, which is focused on using small molecules to target neuroinflammatory pathways for neurodegenerative diseases. But it's certainly an area that we're looking to do more in, and particularly as we invest, similar to Steve, at a very early stage, we do both kind of company formation work in terms of helping to spin companies out of academia, as well as investing in established companies. Neuro is definitely an area that we're kind of particularly bullish about finding exciting new opportunities.
Oh, you can put it down. Great. So we heard from our panel what their interests are. So we're going to start a discussion. The audience is welcome to ask questions. I just ask that you lift your hand and you use a microphone. Otherwise, nobody will be able to hear your questions. So, Vlad, you mentioned that Big Pharma walked away from the fields of neuro and psych, and to your advantage. However, the clinical trials for example, neurological diseases tend to be very challenging, right? Because they take a long time, the readout takes a long time to get, the placebo effect is very high. How do you manage the risk of running such a high-stake trial on limited budgets, basically?
No, it's a great question, and as Steve, I think, was saying, it's one of the hardest areas to research. There's no doubt about it. And I think that's why a lot of investors did say no to us when we said we wanted to start a neuroscience company in pharma was leaving. So what makes it so challenging? First is we don't know a lot of the biologic underpinnings of the diseases we're researching, right? That's changed now. So I think we're in a much different position than we were previously. But the other challenge is we have a high failure rate because when you think about it, some of the diseases we study, they don't even have a validated rating scale, right? And you might be studying that rating scale for the very first time. There is a lack of biomarkers within our field. And of course, as John knows from the mood disorders and even the schizophrenia research, high placebo rates, right? And placebo isn't just somebody being suggestive and getting better. Your body, with depression and others, finds a way to cure itself, right? Whether it's your self-talk, your environment, your support system, things improve. So you have to deal with all of these variables. And then we also study diseases that are very heterogeneous, right? So when we say depression, like John, what's depression? Is it one disease? Is it 5 diseases? Is it 10 diseases, right? It has a different biologic basis, and you put it all into one category. So I think our job, as business individuals who have been crazy enough to go into neuroscience, is how do you increase probability of winning? How do you decrease the failure rate? And number one is the people, your team. You have to have highly experienced people who understand these pitfalls and know how to maneuver them. And there's certain things that you can do to decrease placebo rate, for example. So now in some of our mood disorder studies, we actually don't tell the investigators what time point our primary endpoint is, right? Because if you tell them that, guess what? Everyone feels better at the end. It's the graduation effect. Study's over, isn't this great? Like, we all did great. And the rating scales go up and it sinks your study, right? So, one tool is you mask the primary endpoint for sites. People use central ratings as another, potential tool. And then there's always the statistical way overpower your studies, which in our field you have to do. And so if you overpower, you can get rid of the heterogeneity within trials and the noise. So you can see that there's a lot of complexities to these trials, and those are some of the things that we do to decrease risk, increase probability of winning. You're not going to win in all your trials, but you have to win in order to fund your company and advance other science. I don't know if any
Anyone else?
Just a comment on a really very simple idea that ties what Vlad is talking about to precision medicine strategies, which is that a lot of our medications in a broad population will have a relatively small effect. And so you have to study a lot of people. And the more you can study the population where the medication is particularly targeted to their pathology, the larger the effect size and the smaller number of the patients that you need to study in order to detect a signal. One of the kind of striking things about this new generation of medications that seem to be emerging is that they seem to be having a larger effect size in targeted patient populations, or they're targeting phenotypes that are more narrowly defined than the broad profile of depression. So I'm thinking about, we were talking about Nomura, and they are studying a drug that's targeting anhedonia as a feature of depression. So if you have a clear phenotype that you're studying, that sometimes gives you more traction as well.
And then just to add on that, so neurology doesn't feel left out since we're talking about psychiatry. Again, there's a lot of biomarkers that have been developed in the field for neurology. I mean, look at what just has happened with Alzheimer's disease with the amyloid endpoint. And so I think, we can start leveraging our academic partnerships and really understanding what the science is bringing to these diseases, and hoping that can help tailor the patients that we enroll, the disease stages that we enroll. And I think also the genetics are very, very important, and understanding whether you include just a subset, if that's possible, or if you include a broader population, but you make sure that you include a certain genetic subset that may help you with figuring out if your endpoint is, if you'll be able to hit that endpoint or not. So I think that we have a lot of tools in our toolbox now that will allow us to be a little bit, I don't want to say more precise, but allow for better precision in clinical trials. So again, genetics, biomarkers, imaging technologies, which have all really developed in the last 20 years, that have been able to allow us to be a little bit more precise and understanding a little bit more of the pathophysiology of these diseases.
Maybe just to add, I think we've been talking a lot about identifying subpopulations and our understanding of the biology evolving over time. I think the other interesting thing here is that we can leverage the improvement in chemistry that's been evolving in other therapeutic areas and really apply it to neurology. And so improve pharmacology, selectively targeting kind of known targets and figuring out how to improve the therapeutic window or the safety profile. And I think those areas have improved probability of success as well and are quite interesting.
I have a question for Allyson. One of the topics, sorry to put you on the spot again. One of the topics that was mentioned here was repurposing of drugs. So for example, use of psychedelics for treatment of refractory depression cases. Besides the success of these drugs in the clinical trials, there are issues about protection of IP, right? Because most of these drugs are known. They have been used for a long time. How do you as an investor feel about it, about the repurposing of drugs?
Yeah, I mean, we think that repurposing drugs is great. You have large safety databases, you understand these drugs, but certainly understanding how you get exclusivity and kind of protect the market opportunity is important as well. And so for some, you can modify the molecules to still get composition of matter. You can also think about different formulation plays, right? So there's a number of ways that you can drive exclusivity for existing drugs while still leveraging the understanding of that mechanism and the safety known for that molecule.
Perfect. I don't know, do you have any?
No,
Microphone.
I think those are all the ways that you can do it. I think that it's better to have novel composition of matter, but there are other ways. And I think that there are a bunch of areas of medicine, and this is actually the business challenge, where you would like to see these studies run. You'd like to see the repurposing. So trying to figure out how to do that, I think, is in the end an important aspect of drug development, because there's, and the other possibility is drugs that have failed, or drugs that where the company has become discouraged because of a phase 2A. If you can select if you can find a biomarker, I mean, and I think that we're here with neurodegeneration to a limited extent. Psychiatry, I don't know, are we anywhere with imaging or ECGs or anything? I mean, EKGs?
Not that you can take
EEGs,
to the bank.
Nowhere, yeah. So I think I mean, the thing that changed for Biogen, but the thing that changed MS was really imaging, and that changed everything. I think that biomarkers, genetic targeting really would be a wonderful thing, and mixing in a couple populations to see, sometimes you have a theory, the theory's wrong, you don't want to blow the whole study, but if you have a subpopulation, you now have a hypothesis. So.
Okay. Just a comment that two other strategies. One is through combination of medications for a new formulation that combines multiple medications that might address some of the limitations of the existing medications. And then compass pathways, and to some extent maps as well, with psilocybin and MDMA, are hoping that by patenting the drug in combination with a very tightly regulated psychosocial intervention, that combination would be patented as opposed to just the molecule. We'll see how well that works.
Are there any special challenges in recruiting people for clinical studies in psych or in neuro compared with, for example, cancer? Is there any thing in particular that differs?
Yeah. Well, do you want to? Go ahead. We're a very polite panel, which is one of our great strengths and weaknesses.
I'll bring some alcohol.
One challenge is heterogeneity, which we've also talked about. One challenge we did not talk about is comorbidity. And so I guess that's one source of heterogeneity, which is that when a person has an illness like depression or schizophrenia, they may also have many other kinds of related problems that complicate their clinical profile, recreational drug use and other kinds of issues. And then, one thing that we haven't talked about is that oftentimes we're interested in a subset. So in schizophrenia medication development, when I started out, which was in the era of testing a drug called clozapine, we were trying to find the absolutely most refractory patients to engage in treatment, because clozapine ended up showing an advantage for that subpopulation. That informed a generation of antipsychotic clinical trials, which all failed, in part because most drugs don't work in that population. So we now understand that the biology of the disorder is not static, evolves over time, and that for many treatment mechanisms, they're most likely to work in the early course of schizophrenia. But if you target the early course of schizophrenia, now you're targeting a much smaller subset of all of the patients with schizophrenia, which makes recruitment a greater challenge. So we're dealing with those. When you focus on subpopulation, you make recruitment a little bit harder.
And I think to add on that, whether you're talking about psychiatry or neurology, having a placebo is hard. These are, at least for neurology, we have neurodegenerative diseases. For psychiatry, they have disease that has a big impact on their life as well as caregivers' lives. And some people just don't want to be on the placebo. And I think there's ways around that. This is why some companies, even though it is more expensive, we allow for open label extension, so people know that after a certain period of time, they will get the drug that will help with recruitment. But also timing of trials is also important. With whether you're talking about psychiatry or neurology, sometimes being a little bit longer is better. You could see progression a little bit better, all those things. But if you're on a 2-year trial with placebo, some people don't like that. And then you get dropout, which is a problem. So it's this fine balance of trying to figure out, what is the best timing of your trial? And that's where natural histories become important. Discussions with academics who treat these patients become important. Experience of the team within the company who have done this before or understand trials become very important. And then potentially allowing for open label extension trials to allow patients to get access to the drug, but can help with recruitment as well as retention.
Anyone has anything to add? No?
You've heard from the experts. I guess the only other thing was a question is, certainly in psychiatry, sometimes you have patients with lots of social issues. And that, to me, seems like it would probably present a problem or make it more difficult to recruit, and imposes all kinds of ethical issues as well. Is that generally true?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Uber helps, so, now we can do things like pay for Uber or pay for a car service to get them to their appointment. So, incorporation of technology to get people to where they need to go, is important. And I'd say psychiatry, it is much more challenging because of those issues, Steve, that you mentioned. Neurology, it's actually become a little bit easier because think about this. If you have memory problems and you're now amyloid positive, you're going to be highly motivated to get into a new trial. Definitively you have the disease. If you have a DAT scan and you're positive, you have Parkinson's, you're going to be into one of these trials. You're going to sign up for Prothena's alpha-synuclein antibody, right? So the definitive diagnosis actually helps you in neurology get there. Psychiatry, it's a lot harder. What's the right, diagnosis this person has? They don't want to be seen at a psych, clinic, and then the social reasons. And so I think there are more challenges still in psychiatry.
Yeah, and I just add one other thing, which is that psychiatry has been stigmatized and unsupported in terms of, relatively undersupported in terms of availability and access to effective treatments. Patients and their families get discouraged by the partial or limited responses that they have to the standard medications, and they become hopeless about the possibility of ever getting better. And one of the things about getting involved in research is a spark of hope that something could change. And so one of the things we need to do a better job is educating the public about the ways in which these transformative new treatments and research studies offer paths to hope that make it reasonable for them to consider getting involved. And I think that that these new generations of treatments will help us in that effort.
And just to follow up on what John said, I don't know if anyone's seen our What If OCD commercials, but when you recruit for psychiatric trials, you actually have to break down the stigma, right? To John's point. And so we had to do a media campaign and a social media, direct TV, about what it's like to have OCD and all these terrible thoughts, but what if it could get better? That installation of hope, that it's okay to talk about what you have, others have it, and here are real patients sharing with you their scary thoughts, right? But what if it got better rather than all the negative what ifs for OCD? And that actually can be very effective in recruitment of patients. But it's not like, neurologic disorders where you just advertise you have a potential disease modifying therapy, you're going to get your study flooded with patients. In psychiatry, it's not just you have a promising therapeutic, you have to break down the stigma and you have to overcome the social issues that prevent people from getting to the office.
So, Ellie, what do you see the future of therapy in the neuro or psych areas? What is getting you excited these days? Of course, if you're starting today, you're talking about something that's going to be in the clinic in 10 years. But what do you think are the areas of most interest at this time?
Yeah, so over the next 5 years, one is I'm just excited to see a lot of these things read out, right? Like TREM2 agonists, are those going to be successful or not? And especially as we look at areas like neuroinflammatory targets, really seeing those come into patients, get through the trials, I think is going to be incredibly telling. I can tell you one thing I'm personally excited about right now, which is super early, but I'm really interested in degradation technologies in neurodegeneration. And so in particular, thinking about like the degradation of tau or intracellular tau for Alzheimer's disease. So again, that's looking like really, really early, but I think that there's an incredible amount of exciting things that we'll be able to monitor over the next 5 years, both in terms of clinical trial outcomes as well as advancing things that's early in academia.
Yeah.
But just to highlight something, which is the availability of a PET scan radio tracer to detect tau in the brain makes these kinds of treatments so much more direct in terms of identifying appropriate patients and having meaningful surrogate clinical outcomes or even primary biological outcomes. It's really transformative. I think this is a time, we've had neuroscience for a while, we've had psychiatry, neurology for a little bit longer, but maybe this is the first time that the two are really, there's a meaningful interplay between the two, and it really is exciting.
No, I totally agree. I think, for a long time it was small molecules and biologics, and now we have things like siRNA, ASOs, CRISPR, gene therapy. It really opens up everything, and it's a very, very exciting time in neuroscience, because it's not only imaging and digital technology, but you have different modalities to go after these diseases. And so I think in the past, when something didn't work, it may now work. And so it's really, I think, a fun time to really be in the space.
And some of the areas I'm most excited about are protein degraders. Agree completely. I think that is going to be at the forefront in the next 5 years. But also learning more about the modulation of the immune system. I think Steve commented about oncology. Is where we are kind of where 10 years ago. Now we are kind of where oncology was 10 years ago. And we remember immuno-oncology. It transformed the entire field. I think you're going to see neuroimmunology transform the treatment of neurologic and some psychiatric disorders again, and that was completely underappreciated before, that the important role that the immune system actually plays in neurologic disease. And we used to think of your prototypical immune-based neurologic disorders as really just being myasthenia gravis, maybe Guillain-Barré syndrome, but now Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS, seizures that come from autoimmune, antibodies, a whole variety of disorders, encephalitis of various types from auto antibodies. So I think targeting the immune system, getting your body not to attack amyloid plaque and cause degeneration in the hippocampus, getting your body not to attack the alpha-synuclein and the substantia nigra, which causes neurodegeneration in Parkinson's. Yeah, I think that's going to be a very exciting area in the next 5 years.
Yeah, and we used to think of neuroinflammation either as an inflammatory disorder or as sickness behavior, like if you have the flu. But we don't think of neuroinflammation as depression. We don't think of neuroinflammation as cognitive impairment, and yet we're now so aware of how a normal neural function is regulated by the immune cells of the brain, the microglia. And I would just highlight one other kind of treatment that we haven't talked about as we better understand the role of circuit dysfunction in the pathophysiology is also neurostimulation modalities and brain-machine interfaces as rehabilitative treatments. So it's really so much that is kind of exciting and emerging.
Oh, no, you want to go?
No, you go first.
It is a polite crowd, John. Yeah. I just wanted to jump on the neuroinflammatory pile here, because I think that is one of the most exciting areas, and there's a bunch of targets right now, and there'll be readouts, you have now a deep appreciation. You have two systems that are the two systems in humans that contain almost the exact amount of an incredible amount of information, and they're connected. And I think there's pretty good evidence that it actually goes both ways at this point. And trying to figure that out is going to be big. There's the general kind of targets of like NRLP3 and a number of others that are going to be direct targets, but then trying to figure out the micro, I would say, programming that can affect things on a more subtle level, that's more futuristic. I did have a question in terms of how the experts on the pointing maybe at the people who've got deep experience here, how you view in terms of psychiatry, if you look at what happened originally in neurodegeneration, you looked for specific genetic mutations and you went after, in some cases, trials in those patients first. So familial Alzheimer's is a great example, certain subsets of Parkinson's patients. Is there any effort in psychiatry to go after what are a couple of the few known kind of, I would say, familial forms of the disease?
I thought you were going to answer.
No.
I was like, all right.
Well,
Tanya, you want to
I
start
was
here?
including you.
So yeah, that's a good setup for me because one of the areas we're interested in, there's been a genetic association between ANC3, which is this gene that shuttles potassium channel up to the surface in bipolar disorder, and we're looking at a very novel Kv7 activator that we think can normalize neurotransmission for people with bipolar disorder. And bipolar is the most genetically inherited of psychiatric disorders. So you're right. I think when you start looking for clues, you want the disorders that have a high genetic load, like bipolar, and then you look for where's the clue. Well, ANC3, which is connected to this KCNQ and Kv7 channels, and that becomes our target. And so in the fall, we plan on launching a bipolar disorder study with that in mind. We'll see if our hypothesis is right, but at least we have some clues and we have a roadmap to try to get there in bipolar. I can't say that for a lot of the other psychiatric disorders.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, what Vlad is highlighting is that there are kind of two classes of genetic risk for psychiatric disorders like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, or autism for that matter. There's common variants, and so for a disorder like schizophrenia, you may have 450 common variants contributing to the risk of schizophrenia, and any one of those variants has a trivial impact on the risk. So one of the strongest, most strongly implicated common variants is a gene that codes for an immune gene, complement C4. And if you have the risk variant, it increases your risk from 10 out of 1,000 to 12 out of 1,000. Trivial risk on its own. Yet people are pursuing what is the meaning of that and what is the biology and how does that translate into the biology and progression of schizophrenia. On the other hand, there are rare variants that are present in vanishingly few people. For example, a mutation in the gene that codes for the alpha-3 subunit of the AMPA-glutamate receptor increases your risk 50-fold, meaning you go from 1 out of 100 chance to a 50% chance. So although we do not yet have causal variants that account for all the variants in the risk for diseases, we now at least have genes of enormous impact, GRIN2A, SET1D, et cetera, et cetera. I could go down the list. And we're able to track these genes in cellular models, introduce them into neurons derived from stem cells. We can induce them in animal models and try to understand what the underlying biology is, and then to work from a deep understanding of the circuit dysfunction, mechanistic dysregulation in those cellular and animal models to novel therapeutics. We can kind of approach it in a convergent way, which is about as close, I think, at the moment that we can get to, because the people with these rare mutations are so vanishingly rare and not well characterized that they're hard to collect in any one place or even in a set of centers to really study them.
And to just follow up on John's point and also tie it into the protein degrader. So where might we start in psychiatry and protein degraders? Like how could you use a protein degrader, in psychiatry? We've come to understand that there's a rare small number of individuals who have an autoantibody to the NMDA receptor and develop psychosis, right? Like, maybe 5% of people with psychosis have it because they have an autoantibody. And so now with one of our technologies, we can target that to be degraded. And if you get rid of the autoantibody, you can get rid of the psychosis, right? And that was never even thought of or heard of, right, John? Even 5 years ago or 10 years ago, where you just be labeled schizophrenic your whole life, but you had an immune-based disorder causing that. And now we can target it and hopefully have a higher probability of winning with that compound because we understand the biology.
The first Nobel Prize in neuroscience was for Wagner Jaureg, who cured tertiary syphilis with malaria by infecting people with malaria. And that was the first treatable form of psychosis that we had, and was the first Nobel Prize in neuroscience. So we've come, thankfully, a long way from there.
So maybe now we can have some questions from the audience, if anyone has one. I see a hand go up here. I can't see much, the lights are too strong.
Thanks for this great panel. And several of the panelists, like Tanya and John, have talked about the importance of genetics. I'm wondering if you can talk to genetic testing that's currently going on in neurology. How prevalent is it? What are some of the barriers to getting patients genetically tested? And what are some of the success factors that push it forward?
I can start. So when I was at a different company, not Biohaven, at Sanofi, and I love saying this, we did the first industry-sponsored clinical trial in a genetic form of Parkinson's disease. It was GBAPD, and it was hard. To be honest, it was very hard. You have to be thoughtful. I think when you have a potential molecule that can work in a genetic disease, with something like Parkinson's disease, neurologists, the panel is there for you to test, but most neurologists don't test because there is no reason for testing. You don't change your treatment paradigm. So as Vlad was saying, and others on the panel were saying, it's a lot of going out there, educating people, saying, you need to get tested, and this is the reason why. And as a company, Sanofi put forward genetic testing for Parkinson's disease for the trial. And we had to have genetic counseling before and after, because it has implications not only for the patient, but for the family members as well. But it's doable. It's doable, and you just need to be thoughtful in how you approach it. Again, it's the partnership between the academics, the site PIs that are treating the patients, understanding what the patients need and want, talking to clinicians who do genetic testing, understanding what patients need and want, and then trying to implement it in your trial. I think for some diseases, it's a little bit easier, right? So things like SMA, there's the genetic Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Those are more common and it's more routine. But as the genome becomes more, people are becoming more and more aware of the importance in understanding their genes and the implications of having a genetic defect and being more proactive in their own health and going forward to look for clinical trials that they may qualify for. I think that it's become a little bit easier now than it was even 5 years ago.
Yeah, I would also just add that I think particularly for rare genetic neurological diseases, it's becoming much more popular. And as we have things like ASOs, right, that might treat Huntington's or SCA or other indications, we'll just see it more and more rapidly done.
Yeah, there's one.
John, ooh, it's very loud. John, you touched on this briefly, but Given the importance of diagnostics for innovation, because they help you identify appropriate patients as well as determine effectiveness of intervention, what type of investments being made in diagnostics and early detection? Because we haven't really seen it talked about at all, in many of these panels.
Yes, well, I think that there are a number of groups that are working on trying to make available diagnostic guidance tools or self-assessments. CVS Pharmacy, for example, put some of the depression screening scales on their website, and that people began to use them. There's been, so I think educating clinicians has been one of the ways, primary medical physicians, and mandating, many healthcare systems now mandate depression screening in particular, substance abuse screening to some extent, as a requirement for all clinic visits. I've noticed this when I go into, if I get my knee checked, the question they ask me is, am I feeling depressed? And I go, well, that's weird, but it's wonderful at the same time that someone is, wondering if I'm depressed. And in psychosis, one of the big challenges has been again, lack of public education and lack of early intervention. And so there's a large national initiative, actually headed international initiative called ProNet, developed at Yale to try to map good clinical assessment tools for the early pre-diagnosis phase of psychosis, psychotic disorders, and to try to develop interventions to try to prevent disability and diagnostic conversion. It's having diagnostic tools available and having the right people there to interpret them is obviously a critically important part of this process.
I also think it has to do with, is it going to change the treatment paradigm? So I think there was a period of time that for neurodegenerative diseases, it was a little bit like, why would we put capital into companies if having that data isn't necessarily going to change the treatment paradigm? But I think that's changing. So we, for example, have a diagnostic company, which we rarely do diagnostic companies, but this company is focused on neurodegenerative diseases, particularly because we now feel we're at the point that could really have an impact on patients, and therefore will be a diagnostic that will actually get used on the market.
And talk about, oh, sorry.
I was just going to add, often the business model will be the drug itself too, but you'll have a companion diagnostic or the ability to stratify a patient population or identify a subpopulation. And so ultimately, the upside for the company will be driven by the success of the drug in the clinical studies, but the diagnostic, the digital endpoints, et cetera, will help enable the successful development of that drug.
I was just going to add that, not only is it hard to develop therapeutics in our area, but often you have to develop the first diagnostic as well if you want your therapeutic to have a chance. And you saw that in the Alzheimer's field. Everyone who was going after the various new Alzheimer's therapies all were trying to develop their PET amyloid imaging, and we had to help diagnostic companies do that. They weren't approved at the time. We had to help validate those and approve, as well as CSF measures of tau, and amyloid. So it just adds to the complexity of the challenge, I think, in brain research.
And, maybe one last point on that is I suspect and again, I defer to the experts, for neurodegenerative diseases, unfortunately, the second law of thermodynamics, you end up, when things break apart, they're very hard to put back together again. And some of these diseases are easier depression, depending on the level, is going to be easier to reprogram and get out of, and we were talking about that before, John. But some schizophrenia, if left too long, there's that might be harder to put in. You'd love to be able to actually diagnose it earlier, because then it'll affect, just like Alzheimer's, it's going to affect when you treat patients and how you develop those drugs. And you're going to have a series of drugs that, if you find the right population at the right time, are going to be successful, and they would have failed otherwise.
We have time for one more question.
I just wanted to comment on one thing, sure. which is that if we had real definitive biomarkers, then we could intervene before the fully manifest symptoms, and that would be transformative for schizophrenia. And we're not really there yet, but there's a lot of work in that space.
So early on, you mentioned that the big pharma is leaving this, and I agree. I was in Pfizer when they closed on neuro. So how much of that do you think is the case where you're talking about the diseases are getting finer, getting split finer and finer? Basically, you're moving into the equivalent of rare diseases market, and so there's just not a lot of folks there. But now we're talking about all these new biomarkers coming out for the diseases. Do you think big pharma is going to come muscling in on some of the territory that your smaller firms are in, or what do you think is the state of the art now?
I do think as risk goes down, you will see big pharma, coming back into this area. What they've done, I think, the last 10 years is put the risk on the smaller companies to say, look, when you make progress and find what works, like we'll buy it, we'll acquire it at that point or be back in it. But you're starting to see pharma come back in as our knowledge base and biomarkers get better. And I think that's exactly what we saw happen in oncology, especially with immuno-oncology. People focused on that because the probability of success became a lot higher with certain PD-L1 positive and certain anti-PD-1 therapies. And so as we get more and more biomarkers, I do think pharma is going to come back into it. But I have to say, neuroscience is not an area to dabble. You shouldn't be in and out of it, right? For the complexities that we described today, I think the companies who are dedicated to it, know it well, and are in it in the long run, I think they are going to have an advantage.
Yeah, maybe just one other thing I would point out is I think pharma is focused on large indications again. So there was a time when everyone was focused on, very high POS, kind of relatively orphan indications. I think pharma realizes to move the needle of their top line and bottom line, they have to have large peak sales opportunity, and I think neuro represents that. And so as a result, I think there could be continued excitement to explore it, and I think the more we understand the biology and have targeted therapeutics against that, the more that becomes reality.
So, sorry to spoil everybody's fun. This panel has been so informative, but unfortunately it must come to an end. As we learned today, this field of neuro and psych is exploding right now because of a combination of finally understanding the pathways to lead to disease, something that in the past was not available. People just treated the symptoms and hoped that the patient would stabilize, which was often not the case. And now we're attacking these diseases with different modalities, which gives you so much more powerful tools at the end of the day. I'd like to thank the panel. I think if you put great people together, you get a great panel, and that's what happened today. I thank you, everybody. And I thank the audience, and make sure to check your program for the next sessions. And thanks, everybody.